All right, let's stay with the topic of education in what really is an ever-changing world. South Africans may need to change their mindsets. It's getting a matric and a degree is the be-all and end-all of finding a job. Some experts believe, in fact, that grade 9 equips people with enough to continue their studies at a technical college TVET. Well, these colleges, of course, focusing on skills needed by artisans such as mechanics, carpenters, electricians, plumbers, hairdressers and chefs. In fact, just about anybody you encounter on a daily basis. Bigger issue, of course, is there enough in the technology-driven fourth industrial revolution? Well, an expert in this, good to have him on the show, CEO of training business Gideon Potgieter, joining me now to discuss this from Resolution Circle. You are the CEO, Gideon, so you're well-versed on this. Good morning.
Yes, good morning.
First of all, explain to me, where do you think this concept of it has to be a matric, degree, job comes from? Because it's very much a stereotype, isn't it?
Absolutely. Look, the point is, if you consider where technology is going, we obviously do need engineers and we do need technologists and technicians, and they obviously need to go to university to obtain their relevant qualifications. But if you look at where the real work is, if you look at the work floor, if you look at the job floor, factories and so on, the people operating those machines and configuring those machines and call it programming those machines would typically be artisans and operators, and they certainly do not need a full-on tertiary qualification like an engineering degree. So we typically look at the system as saying it's a pyramid. You know, so you only need so many engineers, but you need so many more technicians and certainly even more artisans. So I always like to say that, you know, if you have a burst pipe, or, you know, if you have an electrical problem at your home or something like that, you're not going to call your medical doctor or your, you know, or your accountant or your lawyer. You need an artisan to come and fix this problem. So in terms of factories and manufacturing, those are really the guys, the backbone of what sets up these systems. And
I think it's probably very good news, perhaps for parents whose children haven't quite made matric or are beginning to wonder about studying after school as well. We're focusing particularly on grade 9, and there's research over in Europe that having a grade 9 qualification and then going into something like a TVET can actually set you up as a career A, but then also how is that going to help us with this fourth industrial revolution? How does this play out for us?
Well, again, interesting, if you look at Industrial Revolution, and specifically again in factories, you know, where we manufacture the goods, the foods that we might be eating, or the cars that we are driving, or the cell phones that we are talking on. Again, the engineers would play the role of the actual design and development of the products, but the real guys setting up the actual machines inside the factories would typically be your artisans. So they don't need to be trained all the way up to engineering level. And if we think, I take robotics as an example. A person setting up a robot in an automotive plant really does not even need matric. We could possibly take a guy with grade 9 knowledge, in other words, you know, language, having mastered the basics of mathematics, certainly at grade 9 level. And we can teach such a person on robotics, for instance, to go and set up, configure that robot, and to maintain that robot. It certainly does not need an engineer. The engineer would be the person working at the company that develops the robot. So, but the person actually installing it and configuring it and maintaining that robot would be an artisan. And the same goes for other Industry 4.0 kind of topics. You know, if you think about this notion of Internet of Things, which is mainly electronics communicating with data back into a system. Again, you know, someone who has mastered basic mathematics, which I would consider to be at grade 9, which allow them into the TVETs, as we speak about, the TVET colleges. In that TVET college, they can then do the trade theory that they would require to master that skill, and then they go into an apprenticeship, which then practically means they get on-the-job training with an already qualified artisan.
Do you find that people that are going through the TVET route and through these artisan training programs, I imagine in a labour-driven economy like ours in South Africa, it's probably a lot easier to actually find a job as well?
It's been quite a challenge in South Africa. So we have this very interesting paradox where we have high unemployment, but yet we also have a high shortage of artisans specifically. So the particular gap we have in South Africa is what I call that missing middle. So we have experienced senior artisans who've been in this for many years, but they have not necessarily kept up with the technology. So it's difficult for them to transfer those skills into the younger generation. So we have probably what you would consider to be a number of senior artisans, and then you have junior artisans coming through, and we're missing that middle. And our gap in South Africa, and specifically in terms of the shortage of skills, is in that middle level layer artisans. So the opportunity really lies in that with this industrial revolution that we are experiencing now, it is really an opportunity to train the youngsters into what is coming, and they would be well set and well ready for what's coming.
When do you suppose government starts re-angling this idea that a matric is the only way to go and that'll take you on to tertiary education? Do you think government and the education department, not from a political perspective, from a communication perspective,
right,
are putting this kind of messaging across? Because I was fascinated when I read this, that someone with a grade 9 can actually have a very, very good career. It's not, as I said in the intro, the be-all and end-all.
Right.
If you don't get 5 distinctions in matric and then go on to a 4-year degree, it's not the end of the world.
Exactly. So, interesting enough, what we see in especially developed countries, certainly overseas, and certainly if you look at the Northern Hemisphere and countries in Europe, it's actually quite normal to make this choice early on. So they were typically at about the age of 12, what would be the equivalent of our grade 6, grade 7, they would already start moving into the direction of knowing, are they going to university, are they going to what we call universities of technology, will they be going to the equivalent of a TVET? And in fact, the majority in developed countries, the majority of kids go into TVETs. And what that practically means is when they're 12, 13 years old, they get tested and assessed. And if it points to the fact that they will be going to TVETs, that means they literally finish their school at 16. So they do not go all the way through to matric. So they actually step out at the equivalent of our grade 9, grade 10, they step out, and then they move into the TVETs, and that's well recognized because developed countries understand that to maintain, first of all, to install and then to maintain your infrastructure, it's artisans doing that work. Could be technicians. Now, TVETs allow you to do it at 2 levels, at artisanal level, but you can study further into becoming a technician. So if you were to complete your apprenticeship and become an artisan, qualify as an artisan, you could then go back to the TVET and do the higher levels of the TVET, which would then ultimately allow you to register as a technician.
Okay, so there are many, many options. I've enjoyed this. Thank you very much for coming in to speak to us this morning. It's Gideon Potgieter. He's the CEO of Resolution Circle. Grade 9 is certainly a key to a TVET and a future beyond, of course, matric as well. So we're bringing you, I'm sure, a reaction to that story from learners around the country in the coming days.